Hi guys, when I created this channel, Perpetuality, I was hoping to cover watches that were special, unique, underrated, sometimes even a little bit hard to come by. And I believe that Doxa is an interesting brand because they have a cult following and their watches tend to disappear very quickly in the secondary market. I've always wanted one myself. Now, shout out to my friend Faded Bezel on Instagram, who posts such wonderful photos of the Doxa watches, and he reviews them too. Check out his website if you can, I'll leave a link here. But also, I have an Instagram account that I've been doing watch photography and covering my journey of collecting and watches I've come across. If you're keen on checking it out and following me, I'd really appreciate it. The link is below. Now, Doxa and their limited run watches are a special beast. People love it or hate it, and it's got a bit of a Marmite effect for sure. Shout out to Aubrey who lent this watch to me. This is the Doxa sub, and you'll take a look at what it is. I don't want to spoil it just yet, but this is the most elaborate packaging I've ever seen for a watch. You've got the Doxa warranty card, and inside the foam insert is this orange beast of a watch, the Sub 4000T. This was a limited run watch, and it disappeared quite quickly. It's the only Doxa sub that does not have a steel decompression bezel, which is a trademark of the typical Doxa sub that we all know and love. Now, are they worth the hype? Are they worth the price premium? We'll find out, because these watches are not easy to come by, and competition has gotten extremely good at what they've been doing. Seiko and micro brands have been killing it lately. Let's hopefully leave you with some helpful information. Now, I won't bore you guys with the details here, but just know that the Sub 4000, comparing it to the Sub 300, is like the Empire State Building versus Big Ben in size. Now, they're both very wearable, but just know that they are large watches. Of course, being dive watches, it's okay for them to be a little bit larger. It helps with the legibility, and having the rotating bezel shrinks down the dial, so it's not necessarily a problem. The bezel's special on the 4000. It is actually only 200 available, according to Doxa. It rotates unidirectional in clockwise direction. It does have good action, and the detents are there for you to know that you've clicked it in place. No complaints with it. I do feel, however, that seeing a Doxa without a decompression bezel is a little bit odd. If the case of this watch didn't give away that this was a serious diving watch, the crown should be. It's good for 1200 meters. Now mind you, it's a little bit undersized for the rest of the watch, and I feel like even though it's knurled, it could be a little bit bigger. Now you would think that Doxa, especially of a watch of this quality being limited run, would have special care and attention in the dial, and you're not wrong. The printing is sharp, and even the hand stack is quite tight. No tool marks whatsoever to indicate that the hands were put together hastily. There's a gloss-like quality on the indices. Even the lume that seems to be perfectly applied has a bit of a sheen to it. The hands are very pronounced and they sit in high contrast against the orange dial, orange being the most visible color under deep water. Even looking at the date wheel and the way that the date wheel lines up within the window is near perfect. I feel like the dial quality on this Doxa is worth of its price. Interestingly enough, this watch does have a power reserve meter, and the power reserve meter has a handsome little arrow hand, and the overall gloss-like quality of the dial does really indicate that this watch is of the next level in terms of its lineup for Doxa. Beautiful details. Now, it wouldn't be a Doxa if it didn't have an ETA-based movement, and in here is the ETA 2897 with the power reserve indicator at 7 o'clock. Interestingly enough, this movement is good for 42 hours of power reserve, and it is beating at 28,800 vibrations per hour. Now, getting on into the finishing, you get brushwork at the top of the lugs, and on the flank of the case is this high polished finish, accompanying the signed crown as well. The bracelet is 22 millimeters with zero taper from the top to the bottom. You do get polished center links, which is a bit of a bone of contention with me. The dive extension is available there too to give you a little bit more freedom with a wetsuit. And the buckle, or the deployment buckle here, is a very simple double button actuation. It is quite solidly milled out of stainless steel, and altogether the quality of the bracelet is to be expected of a watch that is above $3,000. With the only complaint I have, those center links will attract scratches. You just have to live with that. The back of the watch features the jellyfish logo that is synonymous with Doxa since the 2000s, and as you can see here, there is a helium escape valve that will allow this watch for 1200 meters of water resistance and resurfacing. Now, this is not a small watch by any stretch of the imagination, and it might just be the largest dive watch I've ever tried at 47.5 millimeters in width and 48 millimeters lug-to-lug length. It definitely stretches the limitations of what my 6¼ inch wrist can wear. Mind you, it is actually pretty cool looking, and I feel like I'm going to be beamed up to my spaceship at any time wearing it. It's a little bit on the large side, but it's not bad. The Sub 300T is a very different animal from the 4000, being that it does have that decompression steel bezel you see here, and much more wearable too, at 42.5 millimeters. The bezel, though it is unidirectional and good for 120 clicks, does seem to attract scratches like no tomorrow. And if you're not a fan of scratches or character marks, they like to say, Doxa is not for you, especially not the Sub 300. That's been an issue with the paint fading as well. The beating heart of this watch is the ETA 2824. It's pretty familiar movement to all, 38-hour power reserve, 28,800 vibrations per hour, nothing out of the ordinary here. The dial details are not as exquisite on the Sub 300 as to the 4000. Now that makes sense because this is half the price of the 4000. You do get a matte graining texture on the dial itself for this Caribbean blue. And the Doxa logo and the Sub 300 text are sharp, they're applied nicely. The indices, they lack that glossy quality of the Sub 4000, but they are perfectly applied. Now the minute hand is in orange, as that is the most important hand to follow when you're underwater. If you're determining how much oxygen in your tank, that is. The orange being the most visible color underwater. The date wheel sits perfectly with the date having no imperfections that I could see. And the overall hand stack is tight and seems to be of high quality with no tool marks. The overall bezel with the decompression timer on the outside is unique to the Doxa Sub 300. And some may complain that it is a little bit harder to read because you have two numbers to look at. I think it's a cool feature. Although, would you ever use it in exercise? Maybe not. The overall feeling of this watch is that for its price point, it's done well. There is a bezel pip that is lumed. That bezel pip at 12 o'clock in the orange is actually lumed in orange, which is a nice feature. Now when we get on to the finishing and the fit of the watch, the Sub 300T is pretty good. You have brushed surfaces at the top of the case, and then it's separated by high polished surfaces on the side of the case, and the bracelet buckle is also brushed as well with the jellyfish logo. It does have a double button deployant, and you can open up just like so with a dive extension too. I found myself using the dive extension a bit because the rubber bracelet here that you see has to be cut down to size, and there was just no perfect size that I could find for my wrist. So there had to be a bit of a leeway to center the clasp on my wrist. Now, this is not a thin watch. It's 14 millimeters, but it gets away with it with its beautiful contours, and overall the height is pretty much on top of the mid case, which is the bezel. The finishing is superb. As you can see here, the brushwork I've seen on the top of the lug seems to be done extremely well. No complaints here. When we flip the switch and we look at the overall finishing of the watch and we tie it together with the other side of the case, we see the helium escape valve. And this is what enables this watch to be so water resistant, up to 1200 meters, as same as the Sub 4000, but in a smaller case. Now a big reason why I went for the rubber strap is comfort. The beads of rice bracelet on this watch does not taper down towards the wrist. The end links stick out. So this means that overall the 44.5 millimeter lug-to-lug length of this watch is best appreciated on the rubber strap, and you can see it fits within my wrist very well. First we have to answer the question, is it worth it to go into a Doxa? Are they worth the hype? The short answer is no, and that might upset some people here. Don't get me wrong, I love Doxa. I love the fact that they harken back to their original designs and they were revitalized in the 2000s to be even better, and now they're at the best point they could ever be. The problem I have with these watches, however, is the fact that they're far too pricey for what they represent. Now, they are both very different watches, the Sub 300 and the 4000. In thickness, as you can see here, the Sub 300 wears nicer. Now, if someone were to choose between both of these watches, it'd be no doubt that someone that is looking for a Doxa and starting out should go for the Sub 300T. It's much more of an entry point to Doxa, and the Sub 4000 should be reserved for the person who's an experienced Doxa owner. Don't get me wrong, buy what you like, but just understand that at nearly $4,000, that Sub 4000 is an expensive piece of kit. The Sub 300 being around the $2,000 mark is more palatable, mind you. Now, these are not exact prices, but you get the idea that both these watches do represent a price point. Going back into that question, which one would I choose? Well, I did choose, and it was the Sub 300 for me. And I do love this watch, and if you're the person who loves the design, the aesthetic, and can pony up the cash for it, you'll really enjoy this watch, just as I did. Let's check out the Lume. The Lume on the Sub 4000 is actually quite good, and it is super luminova. You see the bezel is also loomed at the 12 o'clock pip. Now, the generous amount of super luminova does pay dividends on the dial, as it is very, very legible, and thanks to that orange dial too, you can't avoid it. It's probably the best color that you can have when you're diving in water, after all. With that being said, if I had to choose between the Lume of both these watches, I think the 4000 has slightly better Lume than the Sub 300T. The Sub 300 features super luminova, but it has a blue hue to it. It's a different recipe. It does shine quite nicely. The only disappointment is that it doesn't last nearly as long as the Sub 4000's Lume. Now mind you, I do enjoy the fact that the blue is a different color, it's evenly applied. On that note, guys, I do want to say thank you for watching. If you liked the video, like the video. Please consider subscribing, click on the notification bell for future videos, and I will catch you in the next one.